George Washington, Farmer Washington. It was well known that Washington's true passion wasn't in military or public service, but in farming. As he went by General Washington and President Washington during his time of service, he went by a title fitting his private profession as well. A letter from Washington's step-granddaughter, written after Washington's presidency, read, quote, "Grandpapa is very well, and much pleased at being once more Farmer Washington." John Adams, his rotundity. During the Senate debates over what the president's title should be, Adams improperly used his position as vice president to interject his own opinion, stating the president should be referred to with something dignified, such as His Highness. In response, senators gave Adams the undignified title, His Rotundity, to vent their frustrations. While the name targeted his plump appearance, it had been given more due to Adams' overbearing behavior. Thomas Jefferson, Sage of Monticello. Jefferson was always renowned for his intelligence and wisdom. Among his many interests were philosophy, science, mathematics, and nature. After his presidency, he retired to his plantation home, Monticello, which sat on an elevation. Visitors described their meetings with the elderly Jefferson as though they had spoken with a sage on the mountain from legends. James Madison, Little Jimmy. Madison was small in stature all his life. As an adult, he only stood at 5 foot 4 inches, and, by some accounts, never weighed over 100 pounds. In his youth, he was also sickly, which prevented him from joining in activities with other boys. To make up for this, he studied and worked excessively. Later in life, this earned him grander nicknames than Little Jimmy, such as Father of the Constitution. James Monroe, the last cocked hat. Monroe was the last president to wear classical attire such as buckles, breeches, and cocked tricorn hats. Modern styles for the elite, such as trousers, were becoming fashionable during his presidency, but Monroe was well aware of his status as the last president of the founding generation. While he wore trousers on a handful of occasions, he generally kept his classical style of dress, symbolizing his role in history. John Quincy Adams, the abolitionist. In his post-presidential term in the House of Representatives, Adams was the leading anti-slavery voice. He denounced the practice at every chance, which sometimes even got him into shouting matches with other representatives. His stances were considered so extreme that some anti-slavery advocates, such as young Abraham Lincoln, distanced themselves from Adams. While being called the abolitionist might seem admirable to many in a modern context, it wasn't always used as a compliment. Andrew Jackson, jackass. Jackson was a different political animal than his 6 predecessors. He didn't come from wealth, prestige, or a well-respected family. Common people found him endearing, but many elites found him crass, stubborn, and stupid, calling him a jackass. Amused rather than insulted, Jackson embraced the nickname. Decades later, the donkey became the symbol of his Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren, the sly fox. With his small and thin stature and his red hair, the comparisons to a fox and Van Buren seem natural, but they were also for his political style. He wasn't boisterous and abrasive like Jackson, but was cunning and agreeable. His opponents, however, called his style manipulative and dishonorable. John C. Calhoun said of Van Buren, quote, "He is not of the race of the lion or of the tiger. He belonged to a lower order, the fox." William Henry Harrison, General Mum. Opponents of Harrison criticized him for being quiet or mum on key political issues. This was, in fact, his party's strategy, to promote him based on his war hero status and on a manufactured image of him as a rugged common man, while attacking Van Buren's character and his policies. Perhaps in response to his mum image, Harrison detailed his presidential agenda in an inaugural address that was over 3 times as long as the average inaugural address. John Tyler, his accidency. Tyler was the first vice president to assume the presidency following the death of a sitting president. Many of his peers argued that he shouldn't have become a full-fledged president, and they referred to him as acting president or still as vice president. Tyler never gave credence to their criticisms, refusing all mail that addressed him as anything other than president. While Tyler set the standard that would be followed by future vice presidents, many during his administration thought of him as an accidental president. James K. Polk, Napoleon of the Stump. In stature, Polk stood at only 5 feet and 8 inches, was skinny, and had a small frame. However, his stump speeches were passionate, powerful, and he delivered them relentlessly, outperforming many of his opponents and peers. His nickname, Napoleon of the Stump, was further affirmed by his debating skills. Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready. During his 40-year-long military career, Taylor was the opposite of a polished desk general. He was accessible to his troops, who he shared in the hardships of military life with. Rather than relying solely on reports, he would take to horseback and survey battlefield conditions for himself. He almost never wore a proper uniform, preferring simple farmer's clothes and a straw hat. This active leadership style, that he maintained even into his 60s, earned him the affectionate nickname Old Rough and Ready by his men. Millard Fillmore, the wool carder president. When he was 15, Fillmore apprenticed as a wool carder. He came from poverty and worked various manual labor jobs while he studied to better himself. He'd eventually enter law, establish a political career, and become a leading citizen in Buffalo, New York. However, many in politics always looked down on him as the wool carder president because of his upbringing. Franklin Pierce, Handsome Frank. Pierce was always known for his good looks. Even as president, he was only 48, the youngest man to assume the office up to that point, and still retained younger features such as dark hair. His eloquent speaking and personal charm also increased his appeal. James Buchanan, Miss Nancy. Buchanan had a close relationship with another Democratic politician, William Rufus King. Both were bachelors, boarded together in Washington, D.C., and aided each other's political careers. At social functions, the outgoing Buchanan would always be close to the effeminate and reserved King. Andrew Jackson referred to them as Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy as they appeared like an odd married couple. Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe. Lincoln's nickname reflected his reputation, and he wore it with pride. His 1860 presidential campaign used the slogan, "An honest vote for Honest Abe." His reputation for honesty was so strong that even his political opponent, Stephen Douglas, remarked, quote, "He is as honest as he is shrewd." The exact origin of the nickname is debated, from the trust he earned in his legal profession, to his objectivity in judging the results of cockfights, to a story claiming he walked 2 miles one night to repay a woman he'd accidentally shortchanged by a small amount. Andrew Johnson, the Tennessee Tailor. Johnson went straight from being a tailor to a politician, making a name for himself through debates and public speaking. Cartoonists often represented Johnson as unsophisticated, trying to solve political problems as a tailor would mend a pair of pants. However, while some used the Tennessee Tailor as a slur, many common working-class people saw Johnson as an inspiration. Even when he was president, he continued tailoring as a hobby, taking great pride in his profession. Ulysses S. Grant, Hug. Grant's birth name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, meaning his initials spelled the embarrassing nickname. Hiram was only dropped as his first name due to a clerical error when he was applying to West Point Academy, a change he ultimately welcomed. He'd tried using Ulysses at a young age to avoid being called Hug, only to receive another unwelcomed nickname, Useless Grant. Rutherford B. Hayes, his fraudulency. Hayes only won the presidency after an extremely close race, the outcome of which was determined by a special commission. The commission found Hayes won by a single electoral vote, a result which was dubious to many. It isn't clear how much political maneuvering took place and if Hayes had anything to do with it. He had a long-standing reputation for honesty, even among his opponents. However, after his victory, he'd forever be considered by many to be a fraudulent president. James A. Garfield, the preacher president. Garfield was the only ordained minister to become president. He converted to Christianity when he was 19, and it wasn't long after that he was traveling from church to church vigorously preaching. His Christian beliefs would later inspire his political positions, as his opposition to slavery was on moral and spiritual grounds. His famed oratory skills were likely gained during his preaching days. Chester A. Arthur, the Dude President. During the late 1800s, the term dude was used for men who liked luxury, so it's no surprise it was applied to Arthur. He owned 20 coats, 80 trousers, and was the first president with a personal valet. Furthermore, he had refused to move into the White House until it was redecorated to meet his lavish and stylish standards. Grover Cleveland, Grover the Good. Cleveland's reputation for honesty, hard work, and character preceded him so strongly that, as a Democrat, he was able to get elected in an era dominated by Republican presidents. Republicans tried to tarnish his Grover the Good nickname by bringing to light a sexual affair from the past. But when Cleveland responded by admitting to his infidelity, he enhanced his reputation as someone who would always tell the truth, no matter what. Benjamin Harrison, the human iceberg. It was said that Harrison could gain 1,000 supporters by giving a speech, but lose each one if he had a conversation with them. It was also said that he couldn't hold a conversation for more than 2 minutes and had a handshake like a wilted petunia. Descriptions of Harrison from the time consistently used words such as cold, quiet, and ice. Political allies realized his personality was a detriment and would try to usher him away after speeches, lest he interact with anyone. William McKinley, Wobbly Willie. McKinley was criticized by his opponents for being easily influenced. They said he was so wobbly on issues such as expansion, not because of deep internal conflict, but because he would be pressured one way and then the other way by cabinet members and political cronies. Theodore Roosevelt, the Colonel. Despite being well known as Teddy, Roosevelt actually hated the nickname and corrected people for using it. The name he preferred was the Colonel, or Colonel Roosevelt. In the Spanish-American War, he'd led the Rough Riders to victory in the bloodiest battle of the war. He preferred having a nickname that reflected his accomplishments. William Howard Taft, Sleeping Beauty. Taft was mostly given nicknames regarding his weight, but his wife nicknamed him not for his excessive eating, but for his excessive sleeping. Taft wouldn't simply sleep in late or take designated naps. He fell asleep doing paperwork, during operas, and even once while standing and talking face-to-face with Speaker of the House Joseph Cannon. Some modern historians believe that Taft's excessive sleeping may have actually been a medical condition brought on by his weight. Woodrow Wilson, Tommy. It might be difficult to imagine America's most academic president having such a casual nickname, but Wilson actually went by Tommy for the first 22 years of his life. His full name was Thomas Woodrow Wilson, and he only began going by Woodrow once he entered the University of Virginia, seeking a more refined persona. Experimentation with names was then a common practice. Though he'd live his public life from that point as Woodrow, some friends and family would always refer to him as Tommy. Warren G. Harding, Wobbly Warren. Harding was derided by critics for his perceived flip-flopping and being wobbly on issues. Like with McKinley, Harding's opponents said he was a buffoon who was ruled by his cabinet and didn't have strong commitments of his own. Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. Coolidge was well known for his silence. He didn't like public speaking and often didn't make public statements on topical matters. In social settings, he sat silently while he let his wife do the talking. In private, he could be very talkative and was said to have a great sense of humor. However, his attitude towards speaking in public was, quote, "The words of a president have enormous weight and ought not to be used indiscriminately." Herbert Hoover, Wonder Boy. Hoover had served as Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce and earned from Coolidge the nickname Wonder Boy for no special love. As a fiscal conservative, Coolidge was often annoyed with Hoover's can-do and activist approach to economic problems, seeing Hoover as someone who believed any problem could be solved by the government. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Feather Duster. As a child, Roosevelt's cousins called him Feather Duster, along with Miss Nancy, for the way he pranced around the tennis court. The name followed him to high school as he supposedly glided by with mediocre grades. Even as he was running for president in 1932, one journalist brushed him off as Feather Duster, saying of him, quote, "He is a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president." Harry S. Truman, give 'em hell, Harry. During a speech in which Truman was talking about his Republican opponents, a supporter shouted, quote, "Give 'em hell, Harry." It then became his 1948 campaign slogan and eventually a nickname. Truman was crass, outspoken, and rough around the edges, especially when contrasted with the polished Roosevelt, so the name stuck. The nickname itself, containing the word hell, was a sign of how Truman was unapologetically blunt. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike. To the public, Eisenhower was well known as Ike, but in his family, he was just one of many Ikes. He shared the nickname with his 5 brothers. There was Little Ike, Ugly Ike, and Big Ike. The names changed depending on the boys' ages. When he was young, Eisenhower was the Little Ike. When he was in his awkward gangly phase, he became Ugly Ike. And when he grew older, he joined his brothers as a Big Ike. Eisenhower was the only brother, however, to retain the Ike nickname for his whole life. John F. Kennedy, Rat Face. It might be hard to imagine one of America's handsomest presidents having such a nickname. Throughout his youth, Kennedy was constantly ill. As biographer Robert Dallek described, quote, "Not a year passed without one physical affliction or another. One of these afflictions made it difficult for him to gain weight, leaving him with bony features, or as his peers described, a rat face." His iconic appearance in the 1960 presidential debates, where he looked like a young Adonis, according to one news correspondent, was actually surprising to many in politics. Behind the scenes, Kennedy still suffered from numerous ailments, but he'd gotten better at masking them. Lyndon B. Johnson, Landslide Lyndon. In 1948, Johnson won a primary race by just 87 of over 900,000 votes. The results raised eyebrows, and it was later learned that thousands of fraudulent votes had been cast for Johnson, and even then, he'd only won by a very small margin. Though the nickname, Landslide Lyndon, was given ironically, Johnson wore it proudly. It did, in fact, speak to the dirty politicking which he excelled at. Richard Nixon, Iron Butt. Nixon was nicknamed Iron Butt for his studiousness in law school. He had a reputation for staying seated and engrossed in his books, while his classmates spent time socializing. Born into poverty, Nixon's intense focus and long hours of studying enabled him to surpass many of his well-born peers. Gerald Ford, Mr. Nice Guy. There's a reason Ford was able to get a confirmation vote in both houses to be Nixon's new vice president. His agreeable and conciliatory nature made him liked by Republicans and Democrats. Quote, "I have had a lot of adversaries," Ford once said, "but no enemies that I can remember." His pardon of Nixon, amnesty for draft dodgers, and eventual friendship with his presidential rival, Jimmy Carter, affirmed his Mr. Nice Guy image. Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Cardigan. In a 1977 televised message, Carter wore a cardigan sweater instead of a suit and tie. His clothing reflected his message of energy conservation, that Americans would need to bundle up for the cold winter. His informal appearance, however, is what left a bigger impression on the public. The folksy Georgia governor, Jimmy Cardigan, was clearly going to be a less conventional president than what the public had gotten used to. Ronald Reagan, the Teflon president. Frustrated opponents of Reagan argued that he seemed to remain blame-free no matter what was going wrong in the country, Washington, or his administration. Democratic Representative Patricia Schroeder alleged that, quote, "He's just like a Teflon frying pan. Nothing sticks to him." Many attributed Reagan's non-stick ability to his charisma and communication skills, which made him very likable to many Americans. George Bush, half-half. Each day at school, a young Bush would split his sandwich in half, offering one half to a less fortunate classmate, saying, "Have half." Growing up during the Great Depression, Bush's well-to-do family was far better off than most, but his mother had instilled in him a strong sense of compassion and generosity. Bill Clinton, Slick Willie. During Clinton's presidency, Republican critics derisively called him Slick Willie for his ability to endure scandals, supposedly charm his way out of controversies, and they generally used it to suggest he was dishonest. But the nickname was originally used by left-wing critics who alleged he ran on a progressive campaign to get elected in Arkansas, but quickly shifted to the center upon being elected. In either case, it referred to his cunning political maneuvering. George W. Bush, W. During his presidency, Bush was often nicknamed W to differentiate him from his father, and because of the folksy Texas pronunciation of the letter W. While occasionally seen as a jab, it was a term of endearment among his Texas supporters as early as the 1970s. It also seemed to capture his image as a president with a laid-back and informal charm. Barack Obama, Barry. Throughout his younger years, Obama went by Barry, a nickname his father had also used as an Americanized version of Barack. It wasn't until after high school that Obama decided to go by his birth name. Quote, "It was when I made a conscious decision," Obama explained in an interview. "I want to grow up." Others speculate that it also had to do with Obama entering college and being exposed to ideas that made him more comfortable with his African heritage on his father's side and less concerned with just fitting in, which he'd often tried to do in his youth. Donald Trump, DT. Trump's childhood classmates claimed he went by various nicknames, including Trumpet and Donnie. However, it was the nickname DT, Trump's initials, that seemed to hold the most significance. One former classmate from elementary school recalled that Trump was in detention so frequently due to his pranks and unruly behavior that it led everyone to refer to detention as DTs, short for Donnie Trumps. Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe. Throughout his presidency, Biden was often criticized for showing signs of his age, including stuttering, losing his train of thought, and appearing weak or fatigued. Some even claimed he fell asleep in public on multiple occasions. When Biden announced his presidential campaign in 2019, Donald Trump had made a social media post, quote, "Welcome to the race, Sleepy Joe," the first use of the nickname. Biden responded by calling Trump a clown. Such exchanges occurred often throughout the rest of the 2020 election. If you enjoyed this video, consider browsing the channel for other videos on United States presidents, all the way from George Washington to modern presidents, discussing their political careers, personal lives, and places in history.